Hello, everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be doing something a little bit different, and we're actually going to be talking about the psychology surrounding forensic interviews, especially in relation to children, and what to ask as a mandated reporter. So, in my last episode, whether that be YouTube or the podcast, you guys know that I had said, I probably wasn't going to do an episode this week, and I didn't intend to, but I was able to go to a forensic interview training, which is why I wasn't going to do the episode because I was quite busy. But I learned so much useful information that I would be remiss if I didn't share some of it with you guys. I know a lot of you are probably teachers, coaches. You guys work in organizations directly with children. Maybe you work in a daycare. Maybe you're a doctor. Maybe you're a nurse. This stuff is going to be very useful and very helpful to you guys. So while it helps better me as a law enforcement officer, it can definitely help you guys if, heaven forbid, you're in a situation where you have to report something or a child discloses something to you. So I have some of the handouts that I got at the class as well as the notes I took in my notebook. So I'm going to just kind of walk through some of the stuff that was talked about. And just to get an idea of who the instructor was, her name is Jen Ingalls, and this was held in Chandler, Arizona. And she is a forensic interviewer supervisor with the Child Help Children's Center. She has 18 years of forensic interview experience. And before that, she actually worked with DCS as well. So she's seen quite a few different work environments where forensic interviewing is very beneficial for, investigations and things like that. So, without further ado, we're going to look at my notes, and I do apologize, this is not as scripted as normal. This is very much going to be off the cuff, but I will try to be as articulate as possible. So, when it comes to forensic interviewing and that type of thing, at the end of the day, you as a mandated reporter are really not going to be doing the interview in and of itself, but you can do a lot of things beforehand that are really going to help out the forensic interviewer. First and foremost, you're going to want to have a neutral perspective on whatever it is that you're being told, which can be very difficult, especially if it's in something that has to do with like felony child abuse or sex abuse of a child. That's something that gets a lot of people very heated, very passionate for obvious reasons, right? We want to protect kids. We want to look out for them. So there's no harm in that. That said, you want to be as level-headed and as calm and collected as possible because that's going to be creating a safer, more comfortable environment for the child if they are disclosing information to you. On top of that, you really want to focus on open-ended questions, which is something that we'll get into a little bit later with the handout that I was given. I myself struggle a lot with open-ended questions. I also struggle a lot with this or that questions. Did this happen or did that happen? And the problem with that is it really limits and narrows what the child is able to say. So the goal in general is to allow a kid to narrate as much as possible. It allows them to recall things more freely. They're able to express themselves easier, and they're not trying to satisfy a this or that question or a yes or no question. Like it's just very closed off, very limited. And the four biggest things that you want answered, and the four things that really you're probably only ever going to ask them is who did it, how did they do it, what happened, where did it happen. Things like that. And this was something that she very clearly, like, she reiterated fantastic. The instructor, I don't know if I said her name is Jen Ingalls, and she said, even with law enforcement, you want to limit how much you talk to the kid about the crime and about the incident. Because, like, obviously that's going to be very traumatic for the child. And the more people that ask them about it and have them relive that event, the more trauma you're doing to the kid. On top of that, if, let's say you as the mandated reporter who are a counselor ask all of these detailed questions and it goes to law enforcement and then the cops are asking all of these detailed questions and then it goes to detectives and they're asking all these detailed questions, the kid is going to be more likely to close themselves off out of frustration that, I've already answered this 6 times. Why the hell are you asking me that again? So really the only information that you want is who did it. So you would ask the kid, like, tell me who did that to you. They can narrate. That's an open-ended question. Tell me what happened. They can narrate. Tell me where did this happen? Let them tell you where it occurred. Tell me when did this happen. Now, for the most part, Like, you don't ever want to ask more than that, because then you get into situations where you might be leading them, or it's not recorded, right? Like, you're not going to record this at a school in a counselor's office. So it gets very tricky. So if you're able to establish the who, what, where, and when, and including the how, that's all the information that you really need to pass on to DCS and to law enforcement. You don't need to ask much follow up questions. Now, there is one caveat with that, which is like if you ask a kid what happened and they say, oh, well, Uncle Sam touched me, you're going to have to ask a follow up question, really defining what that touch was, right? Because like they could be talking about a touch on the arm, and in that case, that's not a big deal. That's not something to report. So it's okay to say, um, tell me about the touch, or how did Uncle Sam touch you? And then they can, elaborate and narrate a little bit more. But Ingalls was very, very clear that, once you get that information, stop, don't ask follow up questions, because you don't want to re traumatize the child and you don't want to muddy the waters for the investigation. So, getting that information is super, super important. Sometimes it's hard to get that information from a kid, and sometimes, let's say you're being told third party, right? Like little Susie told little Jimmy, and now little Jimmy's telling you. And little Jimmy may not know the details. It's okay to go to little Susie and ask just those questions. And once you have that information, go and report it to whatever designated parties you are supposed to report it to. So, again, limiting the traumatic nature of it, but also doing your job as a mandated reporter. And you'll probably get a lot of good detail and information if you're using the open ended questions and letting the kid narrate. So you probably won't need a whole lot of follow up in the first place. Now, one thing that I thought was particularly interesting, because it gets a little complex, is that a lot of places try to do the forensic interview first before they do any type of medical examination. And the way that I have always done it where I worked is it's very situational, right? So just for clarification, right? If this is something that happened 2 days ago, obviously you're going to want to get that medical examination done sooner rather than later, because that's important and that's pressing as far as time goes. Now, if it happened 2 years ago, medical examination, one, isn't going to do a whole lot, and two is probably like not necessary. So then you're going to want to focus more on the forensic interview. Now, the reason the forensic interview is prioritized in some cases over the medical examination is that the child's not in imminent danger. So let's say that it's a split custody situation, right? You have mom and dad has kid for a week, then mom has kid for a week, and dad's the abuser, so now kid's with mom for a week. That child's no longer in imminent danger of being abused by the father, so you can slow things down a little bit, set up the forensic interview, and then have the medical examination done. Sometimes you can do that simultaneously. Now, the reason the forensic interview is so important to do before the medical examination is you can get some of the necessary information and pass that on to medical providers ahead of time so they know what to look for. That way, they're not asking the kid the same questions that this child has already answered. So, again, lowers the trauma of the experience. Also, something that I didn't know is that each county should have a specific protocol for how a mandated reporter should operate, depending on like what your role is. So, Maricopa County, which is where Chandler is situated and where the training took place, has a very, very robust criteria and policy for, well, if XYZ happens, then you do XYZ. So I have not looked up the protocol for the county I work with. That's something that I'm definitely going to do. But go ahead and see if you guys have something like that, because it doesn't hurt and it can provide a little more resource and guidelines on what you should or shouldn't do. The website they gave us in class was az.dcs.gov. There may be a similar website for whatever state you live in or whatever county you live in, so you might be able to look it up that way. Now, something that, at face value makes a lot of sense, is that there are technically 3 types of reports. So this is if a kid is the one reporting it. So it's not from a third party, right? It's not like mom and dad found out that somebody at school was harassing and, assaulting kids, so they call law enforcement. This is coming from the child themselves. So there is the purposeful admission, there's the accidental, and then there's the prompted. And these are called disclosures. So, purposeful disclosure, accidental disclosure, prompted disclosure. Now, it kind of makes sense when I explain it, but just in case you don't know, the purposeful disclosure is that the child very much intended to tell somebody. The kid said, you know what, I'm ready, this is time, I'm going to tell a trusted adult. Makes sense. Then you have the accidental disclosure, and this is something like, let's say, a kid's playing house, and they let something slip about their own personal life and their experience, and you ask them later, oh well, did you say X, Y, and Z? And they get scared, or they back off, and they're like, oh no, I didn't say that. That could be an accidental disclosure. Or a lot of times somebody may tell a friend and say, hey, this happened to me. Well, then friend goes and tells a teacher. And the initial kid did not intend for that information to get back and then be passed on to like DCS or law enforcement. So when confronted, they may deny it. So again, another type of accidental disclosure. And then lastly, you have prompted disclosure, which is a kid's not going to go out of their way to specifically tell you what happened, but let's just say you see bruises on the kid's body, something that's not natural, and you pull them aside and you're like, "Oh, how did you get those bruises?" And they then disclose like, "Oh, well, mom and dad beat me up at home." That's a prompted disclosure because you kind of had to guide it out of them or get the conversation started. It wasn't something that they went out of their way to tell you. Now, you can have two types of disclosure. So, sometimes you can have an accidental and a prompted, right? So, little Susie tells little Timmy, who then tells the teacher. So, teacher goes and talks to little Susie. Little Susie did not want that disclosure to get back to the teacher. But now that the teacher is going to talk to her, she's going to eventually disclose what happened and she's not going to be in denial. So then you can have the combination of like accidental disclosure and prompted disclosure and vice versa. It's a very fluid type of situation. Now, what's really interesting um to me is there is a very common perception with like society in general that malicious false allegations are far more common than they actually are. You see it a lot with custody issues, where it's like, oh, well, mom's coaching little Jimmy to say XYZ about dad. The chances of that happening, while possible, are very slim to none. And in most cases, I would say 99% of cases, and I can't remember the specific number she used, but it was something similar to that. There is no malicious intent behind what the child is disclosing. So take it at face value because at some point it's going to come out, whether there is or is not evidence. If it's properly investigated and there's a shit ton of evidence to back up what was said, great. If there's nothing there and it ends up being a malicious accusation, okay, cool. But given the statistics, it all needs to be treated like it is a truthful telling of events. Like the allegations are not made up. It's not like little Jimmy's being coached by mom to make dad look bad because it's not very very common. On top of that, and this is something that I didn't know, but what Jen Ingalls was saying is that kids a lot of times get labeled as liars because they may be kind of wishy washy on some details. First and foremost, kid memories, not as good as adult memories. I, in general, don't have a fantastic memory either, but kids are more prone to forget things, especially very specific details. So they may say, that they don't remember or they don't recall, and then in another interview be able to go into detail. Well, sometimes you may suddenly remember something. And so it wasn't that they lied about not knowing and then later pulled that information out of their ass. They just genuinely didn't know at the time. So just because a kid may, get a little confused on some of the details or omit information, that does not automatically mean that they are lying to you. That is something that a lot of people can get hung up on. And it's important to know that most kids, when it comes to something like this, same with the malicious intent, do not go out of their way to try and cause problems. Do some do that? Sure. But at the end of the day, like you're going to be able to prove that it's a bullshit claim. So just understand that what may seem weird if it were an adult doing it is not always the same as when a kid is doing it, cuz kids and adults very very different. Um so aside from like the inconsistent statements and wishy-washy statements, something that I found particularly alarming, but something that makes a lot of sense, was when Jen Ingalls said that older kids, especially girls, are far more aware of the consequences that come if they were to disclose sexual assault. So, older girls, teenage girls, or adolescent girls, are much more likely to deny something, when prompted or when asked, and much more likely to refuse disclosing information because they know DCS can get involved. I can get taken away from my family, or dad's going to go back to prison. And so they are much more likely to be in denial and refuse to cooperate because they are more emotionally and socially aware of the potential consequences. And that's like really sad, but it's also not something that I found too out of left field, right? Like it makes sense when you think about it. Girls in general are much more emotionally and socially mature at a younger age than boys are. So for girls to figure that out, that does make a lot of sense. And then she also said that boys are more likely to disclose later in life, like much later in life. And it's usually due to a lot of social barriers. She said that, while society has gotten better about a lot of things and recognizing male victims, there's a lot of internalized misogyny and toxic masculinity and issues that boys have to go through. For instance, a lot of men feel that because they were victimized, that makes them weak, and they don't want to look weak to other men. Or, it may be something where they're ashamed to admit that it happened to them because, well, I'm a guy, I'm a boy, that never should have happened to me. Like I should have done this, I should have done that. And that's something that girls experience too, but it's a lot more prolific in boys. Then you have the mentality a lot of times that gets passed around of, oh, well, you were a player. Like you weren't, sexually assaulted by your adult female teacher. You're just a guy who likes cougars. And if you've been on the channel, you know that I experienced that type of sentiment firsthand when I worked in juvenile detention. There was a boy who had a grown ass, he said, girlfriend, and admitted that he had engaged in sexual relations with her, and he was like 15. And I told him, she's what, 22, 23, like you're a victim. And he fought back and said, no, I'm a player. I like older women. So that's another sentiment too. And they may not realize until they're older, like, oh, hey, what actually happened to me was wrong. And on top of that, there are a lot of boys who when they grow up say that part of the reason they never disclose the information is because they didn't want to be seen as gay. And if you were on my TikTok live when I talked about the Boy Scouts documentary, um, that's kind of a real and valid concern. So when the Boy Scouts were having all of their issues with, predators being in the Boy Scouts and abusing and molesting and assaulting children, they said, well, the best solution here is to get rid of all gay people because they're the ones that are the predators. That was not the case. And so they banned all gay scoutmasters, all gay participants, made it this whole homophobic based issue when it really wasn't. And the perpetrators were straight, which, surprise. So there's still a lot of that lingering rhetoric. And I think that's part of the reason, too, why like we need to, as a society, understand that one, if you are a boy and you have been molested or assaulted by another man, that does not make you gay in any way, shape, or form. And if you do realize you're gay, you weren't turned gay because of that experience, okay? And on top of that, there's nothing wrong with being gay, like stuff like that. It's bad. It shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have ever occurred in the first place. And so it's just really sad to think that that's still something that so many boys are afraid of being seen as, to the point where they won't disclose and they will sit with that pain well into adulthood. Um, Next on the notes is that some of the things to keep in mind when it comes to these forensic interviews is that you also need to establish jurisdiction, right? So if little Susie lives in a different county but goes to the county you work in for school, but the crime took place in that different county, you need to establish with that set of authorities what took place. Because if you start with your county, if the event didn't happen there, they're going to send you somewhere else. So it's better to get ahead of that rather than be thrown around a lot. Again, we have written down the who, what, where, when, how, all of that, those questions you can ask, and then just don't don't go out of your way to speak to the kid unless it's necessary. So, like, third party information. So let's just say that mom and dad found something out um, about a school official assaulting their kid. Don't go and talk to that kid. Talk to the parents. Get as much information from the parents as you can, and avoid speaking to that kid unless one of those questions, the who, what, where, when, or how, is not answered. And even then, only ask the question that wasn't answered. So if you have who, what, where, and when answered, only ask the kid how it happened, or something along like those lines for an example. And then, like I said earlier, don't ask a lot of follow up questions unless it's absolutely necessary. Because, again, if they're having to repeat their story 8,000 times, fatigue and frustration are going to set in, and they're going to be less likely to cooperate and want to participate in what's taking place. Now, on the psych side of things, you have free recall memory, and you have, well, let's see here. Yeah, you have free recall memory, and then you have recognition questions. So free recall memory, what that means is it's a lot more off the cuff. It's open ended. It allows for a lot of narration. It's more, you know, you fill in the gaps rather than me suggesting to you what took place, and then you tell me if that's accurate or not. And then you have registration questions, which are more yes or no. So close ended questions. They're very pointed, and they are more in reference to like very specific identifiable markers. So for both of these, let's use the example of a birthday party, right? So if you're like, hey, tell me about your birthday, that's more of a free recall situation where the person is going to just openly tell you, like, oh, at 12 o'clock, all of my family came over. My uncle so and so was there. My aunt so and so was there. At 3 p.m., we had presents, blah, 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 blah. Whereas registration questions, if you're asking a kid, like, did you have cake at your birthday party? They're going to say yes or no. Oh, did you open presents? Yes, no. But those are things that kids associate with birthday parties, right? So that's where the registration comes from. Like, they are going to say yes, and they're going to recognize that cake is part of the birthday party, but it's not going to allow them to extrapolate on the narrative and the series of events that took place. Another thing that Jen Ingalls was very, very adamant about is that some of the only times that you should ever interview a child for those specific questions, who, what, where, when, and how, is if the kid is verbal. So if the kid is not verbal, don't get involved with that at all. Get as much information as you can from the reporting party, because that complicates things a lot in and of itself. Um, and then if you haven't established those questions already, establish those questions. And if you can, use a lot of like exact quotes. So if kid says, Uncle Sammy did this to me, use what they specifically said that he did. Um, so, let's say, for instance, Uncle Sammy touched me on the butt. You can say, you said that Uncle Sammy touched you on the butt. Tell me about that. So reiterate what it is that they're saying. Um, and then moving on, it is not your job as a mandated reporter to really determine the veracity of a claim. So again, it's not your job to say, oh, well, I think she's lying because she couldn't look me in the eyes while she was talking. That's not your job. And, Jen Ingalls talked about a time where a principal basically told a girl who had disclosed that she had been sexually assaulted. This principal was like, I don't fucking believe her. She's a liar. And then the victim was like, well, fuck you guys. I'm not going to work with you. Right. So, like, keep that stuff to yourself and just believe that it happened until proven otherwise. That's usually a pretty good rule of thumb. I would say most logical individuals and empathetic individuals are of that sentiment, but apparently it needs to be said because some people are not like that. Then there's some trickier cases where, like, let's just say this is something that occurred at home or at school. Other kids may be witnesses. Again, they're children, so you have to be tricky with the questions that you ask them. It's okay to ask them the who, what, where, when, and how, because that can help corroborate what the kid disclosed or what the reporting party disclosed. But other than that, you don't want to go beyond that. So it's kind of just the same principle, except they're more of a witness than they are a victim. Another thing when it comes to just the way that kids process stuff and the way that questions should be phrased, You have script memory, and then you have episodic memory. And I already kind of knew what episodic memory was, but I didn't know what script memory was. So, script memory is for repeated events, and it's very, very similar to what we already talked about um, with free recall and then what was it? Recognition questions. It's very, very similar. They kind of build off of each other. So script memory, it would be like, oh, can you tell me what you do at the grocery store? And it's like, oh, well, I always start on the produce side. And once I get all of my groceries on the produce side, I go and then I walk through the deli section. And that's script. That's pre-planned. Like you have that memorized. There's not a lot of specifics there. Now, if you were to say, can you tell me what you did at the grocery store on Tuesday and isolate the event? That's episodic memory because you're narrowing the scope down to a specific instance, a specific time frame. So it really helps you get more into the nitty gritty than just having like a generalized, well, what happened? And then hoping that you get the necessary details. Now, what you can do is start with a script based question such as tell me what you do at the grocery store to build a baseline, and then you can switch to like an episodic based memory question like, oh, okay, I see. Now what did you do specifically on Tuesday at the grocery store? And then you can kind of compare the script answer to the episodic answer. So that's fine as well. But it is helpful to know the difference. On top of that, something to keep in mind is what the kid's primary language is. And this is something that I personally never really thought of because I really don't, where I live, there's not a lot of ethnic diversity. It's a lot of old white people, a lot of college students. But for the most part, everybody speaks English. Every now and then you'll get somebody who doesn't, and we'll use like translator apps and things like that. But if you live in more of a bilingual community, that can be very, very hard. And so while a lot of kids will speak English, it's better if they can answer in their primary language. So if they predominantly speak Spanish, even if they tell you, oh, I want to answer in English, see if you can get somebody who's bilingual to translate for you because it's just going to be easier and more comfortable for them. Because sometimes with trauma, their brain won't encode it properly in English compared to Spanish. Again, not something that I had ever really thought of, but something that's good to know and to keep in mind in case that ever presents itself. Um, Again, we want to have open ended questions and avoid non leading questions. And then something that she talked about, which is very, very helpful, is the funnel approach. Again, kind of goes into using script memory and then episodic memory. Start big and then get small. Um, that is more useful when it comes to like talking to adults. Because again, with the kids, you only want to ask the who, what, where, when, how questions. But let's just say you're talking to mom and dad. It's okay to start with bigger, wider, more open ended questions, get all of those details, and then get narrower into more specific questions. That's perfectly fine. And then obviously, avoid suggestive questions and then avoid giving options like, oh, well, did X, Y, and Z happen or did X, Y, and Z happen? Which is something that I myself really struggle with. I didn't realize I did that so much in my line of work until it was pointed out to me in this training. And I thought, well, that is certainly something that I do a lot of that I probably need to work on. So it was very eye opening for me. Um, because it made me self-aware of a shortcoming that I have. And my job and my goal in my line of work is to always better myself so that I can help people to the best of my capabilities. Because obviously, if somebody's being a child predator, you want to get a conviction on that. So if I can help make my questions better for the parents or for the kid, that's going to help in the long run, especially if it goes to court. Now, some examples of, you know, um, bad questions and good questions. So, for instance, instead of saying, was his hair black, blonde, or something else, which would be that option based question, you say, tell me about his hair. And that allows the kid to narrate. So, let's say the kid doesn't know a staff member's name at the school, and you're trying to establish that who. You can get a description for the potential suspect using that question. Another thing, instead of was he tall or short, fat or skinny, you say, tell me what his body looked like, or tell me about his or her skin color. Um, if they have like a birthmark or something, if you're trying to determine if somebody has tattoos and you're trying to get that description, instead of asking, oh, do they have tattoos? You can say, oh, did you see something on their skin? If the kid says yes, then you can say, well, what was it? Or tell me what it was. And so that really helps kind of allow them to describe to their knowledge and to their recollection what happened, and it's not you inadvertently putting words into their mouth. So I thought that the training was really, really cool. It was only about 3 hours, and I learned a lot personally, and those are like the biggest points on it. There is a more advanced forensic interview training, which I don't think I'll get to go to because I will be on vacation. But if you get the opportunity as a mandated reporter to ever attend one of those, I highly recommend it. Now, if you can't, that's perfectly fine. That's really honestly why I made this episode, is because that way you can use the information that I have disclosed here to better help you in your line of work. So, to wrap it all up, what are the biggest things that we want to take away from here? Number one, we do not want to constantly re traumatize the child. So, the less people that the child has to speak to in detail about the events that happened, the better. Number two, you specifically want to ask the kid who, what, where, when, and how. And if you can answer all of those questions, do not ask follow up questions. It's not necessary because it goes back to point one where you don't want to re traumatize the child. Once you have the information, you can pass it on to law enforcement and DCS, and then they'll get a forensic interview in session. Number three, ask open ended questions. Don't have options, don't give them limited choices, not yes or no. The more that a kid is able to narrate, the better. Number four, the funnel approach. Start big, get small. Starting big and broad helps you get down to the nitty gritty when and if it is necessary. That is more applicable to adults than it is to children. And then, last but certainly not least, number five, if you cannot get a child to specifically say, this is who did it to me, it is okay to ask open ended questions to get a description for the individual, and in some cases, to get a better understanding of the crime that was committed. Like the example I gave earlier, which is, oh, well, Uncle Sam touched me. Oh, tell me how he touched you. Because a touch, very vague. You want to define that a little bit. Once little Susie tells you how Uncle Sam touched her, though, don't ask the follow up questions. You don't need to know how it happened specifically, such as were your clothes on, were your clothes off, things like that. Take that information, report it, and you'll be good to go. And this helps forensic interviewers on the back end do a much better job, and it doesn't stress the child or fatigue the child the way that it would if you had started to get into the nitty gritty with them. Also, pro tip, if you are able to, and this is if, again, I don't know what your guys' policies are for the places that you work. If you are able to record those questions being asked, that is very helpful from an evidentiary perspective. Again, kind of understand if you're not allowed to do that. I don't know if it would be like a violation of rights. I also know that some states are not one-party consent calls. So if you were to record something on your phone, you would have to disclose that that's being recorded, which gets tricky because if a 5-year-old can't really give consent. Now, I will say they asked for feedback in the class and asked about certain things to talk about. And one thing that I really wish they had talked about, and I put on the eval asking them to talk about it in the future, is the complexity of parents being involved with this, because a lot of times the suspect or the perpetrator is somebody that is very close to the victim, and a lot of times it is a parent or a relative, right? And so if the parent is a perpetrator, where I live and I work, that parent has a legal right to be part of any interview that a child is part of. And if the child wants to disclose something and does not want that parent in the room, but the parent wants to be there, the hands are kind of tied because the parent has a legal right to be there. So I was hoping that in the future they might be able to elaborate that on that, and like what sort of techniques, tools, or tactics can be used to help navigate a situation like that, because I have been in a couple of those where you can tell the kid's holding back information because a parent is in the room while the kid is being interviewed. So I'm hoping that I can help them develop that class a little bit with a section like that added, because I think that would be really neat and very, very helpful. But yeah, that is all I have on this. Please let me know if this is useful to you guys at all. If you know a mandated reporter, please feel free to share it with them. Again, I was not intending to make an episode like legitimately at all, but this felt like something that was too important not to share, especially while it was fresh on my mind. You guys know my goal is to help as many people as I can. So hopefully this information assists you. Heaven forbid you ever end up in a situation like this. And in the meantime, please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and as always, stay psyched out.